Welcome to the Importance of Being Earnest video introduction. This is a fairly long one. I'm going to guess it'll be over an hour long, so feel free to watch this in chunks. All right, so the play, it's a play, sorry, written by a man named Oscar Wilde and was published, I think I've got the next one here, yeah, published in 1895, so at the very tail end of the Victorian era. What we're going to do first is I'm going to give you a whole bunch of history of the Victorian era. And although this is going to say Victorian England, and obviously when I talk about the ruling class, and it's going to be specific to England, but a lot of the technology and the advancements, those things were happening in America and elsewhere in the world as well. So just because I'm saying England doesn't necessarily mean that everything I'm talking about only happened there, because that wasn't the case at all. Um, Queen Victoria, this time period is named after Queen Victoria of England. So let's start there. She ruled England. She took the throne in 1837, and she stayed there until she died in 1901. So one of England's longest ruling monarchs. She came to the throne kind of in a roundabout way. She was actually the child of the fourth son of the previous king, and her uncles, I guess her grandfather was on the throne for a very long time, and so his sons kind of grew up and grew old, in their 40s, 50s, some even 60s, without ever really having any sort of responsibility. And then suddenly the king gets sick and can't rule, and there's this mad scramble for his sons to have children, because, oh my gosh, somebody's got to inherit this throne anyway. And Victoria, after some, kind of running through the brothers, nope, can't she can't inherit, he can't inherit, that kind of thing. She becomes the queen in 1837, and really kind of brings stability back to the royal family in England, because there had not been a lot of that for several decades, actually. This is Victoria's coronation portrait, and you'll notice that it was completed in 1838. So this is obviously not actually as she was coronated, but I chose this painting because it gives you an idea of um, what I guess the power of England and the royal family had in 1837, 1838. She is wearing a lot of jewelry. And the thing you need to realize about that is every single one of those stones would have been real. All of those stones around her neck would be individual single-sized diamonds, the size of a fingernail. There are two crowns in the picture, probably symbolizing that she is the queen of more than just England. I would guess probably maybe Scotland is included in this. Eventually, by the time she is, older, by 1901, she's considered to be the Empress of India as well. Also, look at this dress she's wearing, very much a only for portrait kind of dress. The incredible wealth, that really thick, heavy looking velvet, all of that fur. This just shows you how much wealth the royal family had to waste, essentially, because this dress probably represents hundreds of hours of being made by hand for someone, and I would bet she wears it for this painting, and that's it. And that's the kind of money and the kind of power that you can expect with that. Okay, so next, so that's 1838. Obviously a stylized portrait. Here is a photograph of her in 1882. And this is post 9 children. Yes, she gave birth to 9 children, and I believe all of them survived, at least, into childhood. I don't think she had any stillborn. And so she's changed, obviously. But the other reason I've chosen this painting is, again, you get a look at the wealth she's wearing. I mean, those diamonds look like they're the size of my thumbnail. The earrings, bigger. The other reason I wanted this is it's a photograph because we go from a portrait, a painting in 1838 to this photograph in 1882, which illustrates perfectly the technological advancement that happens during her reign. And I mean, she's got another almost 20 years to go before she dies. So a tremendous change happened during the Victorian era. Honestly, you can kind of compare the Victorian era to the Renaissance in terms of how rapidly society changed, the amount of artistic output, the amount of technical advancements. There really was just a kind of another, span of a century or so, or about, where you just get this huge leap forward. Here you are, the massive increase in wealth, power, and culture. And this, I think, has to do with this is coming to, 1837 is going to be post the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution happens in, I'd say, the mid to late 1700s. And so this is, say, let's say 30 years later, whatever. And so suddenly this society, which has been going through tremendous changes when they've been shifting from an agriculture based economy to an industrial based economy with factories. And that kind of happens slowly over a long period of time in the 1700s, but then eventually at some point it's got to hit a point where it kind of becomes like they've got it figured out, they've got the infrastructure in place, and so now it can start to really move forward very quickly, and you get this huge jump in the amount of money produced. You also have England coming off of the Napoleonic Wars, having won them decisively by pummeling Napoleon not once but twice. And so Britain is by far the most powerful country in Europe. I have no idea how it compares with Asian countries, so I wouldn't want to make that comparison, but definitely Britain is the power here. And so this is where you see kind of the culmination of all of that is during Victoria's reign. Here we have a map, and the red or pink outlined places and also the pink underlined places are British colonies. There's a famous saying about Britain during this time period that says the sun never sets on the British Empire. And the idea is that if you were sailing around the world, there would be a British colony in the sunlight all the way around. It was that pervasive. And we know, obviously, from our history that Britain's lost some colonies by this point. So still very, very powerful. And the other thing I wanted to point out is look at the number of islands that are claimed as British colonies. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the British Navy is what is really propelling this colonization effort. The British Navy was the most powerful navy in the world, and they were what enabled this, empire that the sun never sets on. Very much so. Okay, so I've got a whole lot to say about this slide. This is a pretty good layout of social hierarchy, the classes in Victorian society. And in order to really read any historical British literature, this importance of being earnest, and then in the spring when you read Pride and Prejudice, you really have to understand the class setup because it's very different than what we are used to in America today. So what I want to do is I want to start in the upper right with the upper class. And I want to start in the middle of that, which is the royal class. So the upper class, this is where the money and the power is. The royal class means the king, the queen, princes, royalty. Okay. And then right underneath the royal class, and I didn't make this chart, so I don't know why royal class is in the middle, but the next level down is the nobility, which is the middle upper class. See where this says that? The nobility would be anybody with a title who's not a royal. So lord, lady, duke, knight, baron, marquess, whatever. That's that next level down. And these are the people that would have occasionally married into the royals, not very often. Generally, the royals, especially in Victorian time, married other royals. Excuse me, but they're the ones that are right underneath it. And then underneath the nobility are going to be the lower upper class. I know, which sounds really kind of oxymoronic, but these are the people that are incredibly wealthy and still very powerful, but don't have a title. And so you'd call them Mr., you'd call them Mrs., you wouldn't call them Lord and Lady. But they would definitely have power. They would intermingle with the nobility. Those two classes they would consider each other to be kind of social equals. Okay, so that's the upper class in England in this time period. Then what I want you to do is go to the lower right, the middle class. Now, the thing you need to understand is today, to us in America, we understand what the middle class is, and that's an accepted. It's like it's always been there in our lifetime. But in England, that was really, really not the case. The middle class was very much kind of a new thing. The middle class was, the Industrial Revolution basically created a huge group of people who made a lot of money, or a lot more than, say, the poor did, but they weren't the upper class. They weren't royals. Don't do that. They weren't royals, they weren't nobility. And so they were in the middle. And you've got two levels, you've got the higher and the lower. And it doesn't really matter which one is which there, but just know that even though some of the higher middle class people could have as much money and later on more money than many of the upper class really continued to look down on them because they were new money, if that makes sense. Um, the upper class in England, and I know this doesn't make a lot of sense to us today, they judged you by how long your family had had money. Like how many generations have you been rich? And if you've only been rich, you were the one that made the money, then you were never given the same level of, importance, I guess. And so the upper class looked down on the middle class. And as a result, the middle class, they definitely tried to go up. They tried to move up into the upper class. But at the same time, I think there was some anger there. It was kind of like, oh, yeah, we've got all this money. We'll show you. And so the middle class becomes very politically powerful. And you see kind of the upper class losing that power to the middle class eventually. Um, but that's going to happen gradually. Now, if you look over on the left side, let's start with the upper left, the underclass. And that's not really something that we think of today. What I would say this class is going to be is, you can call them the upper lower class, I guess, if you wanted to. These are the people who are craftsmen. They're the ones who work with their hands, who produce things. So if you are work in construction, if you work in a shop, if you make jewelry, or if you make clothing, if you're a tailor or a seamstress, if you are a woodworker, a bricklayer, those people are the upper lower class. They work with their hands. Some of them would obviously be able to have a very comfortable life, but it was hard, physically demanding labor. But they had jobs. Okay, that's the important thing, because when you move down to what this chart calls the working class, and yes, I'm aware that the poor is spelled wrong again. I didn't make this chart. This class were the ones who were the very bottom of the rung, and they were not what we consider to be the working class at all. These are the people who were so low in society they couldn't get jobs. These are the people who lived in slums, who lived, two or three families to a room. And the problem was society in Victorian England and in America, I think as well, was so stratified, which means that whatever level you're born into, you absolutely cannot change that. Well, I take that back. You can go down. That's always a possibility. You can fall, but you can't rise. And you see this especially in this poor class, because what happens is if you're born into this kind of grinding poverty, um, your parents are malnourished, so they can't afford to feed you well, and so you are then malnourished. There is no education for you. There is no educational opportunity at all. If you survive to adulthood, it's because your immune system is incredibly strong and you're really lucky. Unfortunately, you can't get a job doing much more than, maybe sweeping out the floor or something, maybe working as a servant if you're exceptionally lucky. And so, therefore, you can't get a better job. You can't move up. You can't learn a trade, and you're stuck. And then you have children, and the cycle starts all over again. And the Victorians, especially the upper and middle class, really thought that the poor were poor because they were morally deficient, that like there was something in them, that they were bad people, and so it was okay for the upper and middle class to basically spit on the lower class, because it was like, well, they deserve it. Obviously, if they're poor, they deserve it. And so things didn't change very quickly, or they didn't change easily. Obviously, you have people who do work to change that situation, and it does happen. But for our understanding of how this works, you need to know kind of the extreme version of it. Okay, let me make sure I talked about everything. Oh, prostitutes. Good Lord, I almost forgot. Prostitutes, honestly, in Victorian England can be considered a whole other class. And I know this is terrible, but there's a combination of things happening. There's that idea that if you're poor, it's because you are a bad person and therefore you deserve it. Women were given no opportunities at all. It was incredibly easy for a female member of the underclass, the skilled class, to fall. Let's say that she's working as a maid or a cook in one of the upper classes houses. Let's say that Mr. Lord so and so decides he likes the maid, and he basically makes a pass at her. Whether or not he actually forces himself on her, and definitely that happened, she can be fired simply for being there. Um, the woman was always to blame in that situation. And so, whenever you lose your reputation like that, what do you have to do to feed yourself? Chances are, if no one will take care of you, if no one will take you in, you become a prostitute, because that is literally the only way you can keep food in your mouth. And if you were unlucky enough after having been raped to be pregnant, then that makes things all the worse. So you've got a lot of factors happening here, but prostitutes were there was a huge population of prostitutes in England in the Victorian era. And I think they, more than just your standard poor person, got a lot of hatred and scorn from the middle and upper classes, because they were like, oh, women are sinful, and these prostitutes, obviously, they deserve what they get because they're doing something so wrong, which is so hypocritical, because who was it that was paying for the prostitutes? Yeah, the upper middle class. Anyway, so very, very stratified society. Okay, money. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the amount of money and how they spent it in Victorian England, and then we're going to talk about the other side of that, the poor. So, all right. This is a photograph of a house, and actually this house is in Canada, but I thought it was an excellent example of a couple of things. First of all, who had this home? Who owned this home? This would have been an upper class or a really upper middle class home. Nobility, somebody to at that level. God, I keep doing that. Sorry. You can see this upper class person is showing off their wealth. If they can pay for this kind of craftsmanship and what looks like the entrance to their house, then you've got a lot of money here. And the other thing this is illustrating is that that lower class, the skilled class, the workers, the craftsman level, they're the ones who would have made this. So there would be these carpenters, who would have spent hours and hours crafting the wood in this room, the tile work on the floor, putting in the carpet. All of this would have been done by hand by someone who had an incredible amount of skill, and they would have been paid very, very little for it. And that was kind of the other way that the middle and upper class kept the lower classes low, is labor was incredibly cheap. These houses, and I don't have a picture of one of the big houses, country houses in the slideshow, but I know that some of these gigantic country houses could take like more than 100 servants to run on a daily basis. And the only way that a wealthy family could afford that is if they paid those 100 people nothing. And so labor was really cheap. And so, you could afford to have someone come in and spend 6 months making this room out of wood, because you didn't have to pay them very much. Lots and lots of wealth here. Okay. This is a replica Victorian middle class living room. Lots of things going on here. The very first thing that strikes me about this room is the number of patterns. Like every single thing in this room has got some pattern, some decorative element. It's incredibly busy. I kind of feel like it's claustrophobic, like the walls are closing in. But this is a great example of how the middle class tried to show off their wealth. It wasn't enough to have this beautiful table. It had to have that lovely, looks like inlaid woodwork on it. The piano, it's not enough to have a piano in your living room. You've got to have one that's incredibly decorated to show off that you can afford it. Wallpaper, very expensive. So if you can afford to have wallpaper like this, you've got money. You've got what looks like kind of a traditional British tea there. You can show off the tea set. Even the piano stool has probably an embroidered cushion on it. And so this is that Victorian middle class. This is what they found to be fashionable. And this is also, I think, why the upper class, some of them looked down on the middle class. Oh, look at them showing off their money. They're trying too hard. But this kind of gives you an idea of, I guess, what the middle class was trying to do. The next one is, clothing. Okay, we're gonna talk about clothing. This is a Victorian gentleman, and I wanted to show you this picture because it illustrates how buttoned up the people dressed. Um, um, the number of layers that we can see this man has on: a jacket, a vest, and a shirt with a tie. I guarantee you there's at least one other layer underneath that. Now, men occasionally wear this many layers in our world today, but imagine wearing this every day from the moment you left your bedroom in the morning to the moment you went back to your bedroom at night. You always had a tie on, you always had your jacket buttoned up. So very, very formal, far more formal than we are used to. And you've got this brilliant shiny hat that he would wear. There's a picture farther on that has a photo of a street with a lot of men on it. And they're all dressed like this. Very kind of, I guess, uniform-like. Now, the next two pictures I've got are women's clothing. And I went to update the pictures on this slideshow and kind of fell down the rabbit hole, and I restricted myself to only two. I wanted to show you kind of evening dress and day dress. This is an evening gown from about, I think, 1860, 1865 or so. If you've ever watched anything set during the American Civil War, you'll recognize this style of dress. This is a gown that the wealthy would buy several of these every year. And they would wear them once or twice because, God forbid, someone recognized that you've worn the same dress to a party twice. This would have been made by hand. This is before factory created clothing, at least for these people at this level. And so all of this would have been cut and sewn and decorated by hand. The woman who would have worn this dress would have had to go to the shop for multiple fittings. And it gives you an idea of, and well, just look at the amount of fabric in the skirt, how expensive this would be. And this is an actual historical dress that has been preserved. And so you can kind of tell, if you look at the little sleeves, they look kind of dingy and old. And if you look at the trim in the skirt, it looks like kind of, it's a little bit old looking. That's because this dress is, 150 years old. Also, the other thing I like here is the convertible nature, because this is the same dress, but you've got a jacket in the two little pictures off to the side that you can wear over the top for warmth, or if didn't want to show your arms or something, whatever. The next picture, this is probably the same style. Since Victoria ruled for so long, the clothing styles, women's clothing styles, changed a lot over kind of that 80-year span, but I'm kind of hitting the middle here. This, you can see, looks very similar in the basic layout. You've got the really broad skirt. Victorians generally would have been this covered. All the way to the neck, all the way to the floor, and all the way down to your wrists. The evening gown in the previous slide would have been an exception for that. This is something that they would have worn, and again, I tried to find a historical dress. This is actually a preserved dress from this time period. You know, you would have worn this, you would have had probably a dozen or more of these. Probably a couple times a year you bought this many dresses. So a tremendous amount of money going into their clothing. Okay, this is a photograph, or actually a painting, of the Royal Academy of Art, of people looking at paintings. And the Royal Academy of Art is a good example of, okay, they've got all this money in the Victorian society. What do they do with it? Well, George IV, the King of England, one of the kings before Victoria, he founded the Royal Academy of Art. And essentially what that was an organization that promoted art and artists. You wanted to get if you were an artist, you wanted the Royal Academy to notice you and to display your paintings in one of their salons here so that you could become famous. And it was basically just a way for the government to support artists, because they had that kind of money. If you've got a government who has enough money to, basically pay artists to paint, this is not a struggling group of people. So the painters would be put on display in these rooms, and you can see, if you look kind of in the middle, it goes like for multiple rooms. And then the public, everybody could come and see it. And that's the other thing that happens in the Victorian era, is you really start to get people encouraging middle class, at least, not really the lower classes, but the middle class people, to come and enjoy culture. Culture like art and museums and plays and the opera, those things were not restricted just for the upper classes anymore. And this is a group of people who probably include some middle class people if they've got enough money. You can get a good idea of clothing here. The men look pretty much all identical, and the women have all kinds of different colors on. The other thing I think is interesting is how different the display of art is here. If you have been to a museum today, it tends to be a lot of blank wall with a few pieces of art here and there. And yet this, it literally is like the frames are crammed together, floor to ceiling art. We would never think this was an attractive way to display, and yet apparently in the Victorian era, this was okay. I just think it's kind of an interesting thing to see how different, how we've changed. This is a drawing of the Crystal Palace, which was a gigantic building built for the World's Fair in 1851, as you can see. The Crystal Palace was made of metal and glass. It was enormous, and it was very much kind of the pet project of Prince Albert. Prince Albert was Queen Victoria's husband. And again, if you've got a society that can spend this much money on a building for the World's Fair, you've got a lot of money. This building, I think, was burnt at some point. partially destroyed at least. I'm not really sure how you would burn this kind of a building, but I think that was what I remember happening. And they rebuilt it, but then it was damaged again during World War II when the Germans were bombing. And I think they just demolished it at that point. There is no more Crystal Palace in England. They got rid of it. Okay, beaches. This is a photograph of Victorian beaches. And when you look at the people on the beach, you will notice they are fully dressed. The men are wearing all their layers of black. The women have got the long skirts, and the children are wearing basically the same thing they always wear because going to the beach was very popular, but that did not mean swimming. You did not swim because you did not show off your body. If you're in a society where you're not supposed to even show your elbow, then bathing suits are out. And what they did, at least the women, I'm not sure about the men, is that there would have these and those white kind of box things in the background of the painting, maybe what I'm talking about here, but they would have these kind of large, kind of shed-sized boxes on wheels that they would, a woman would get into the box and there's probably a place to sit. And then someone would wheel her out a few feet into the water. And then she would get off of her chair and into the water while she's in the box. Okay. She never comes out of the box, but she can stay in that little kind of shed and enjoy being in the water. She can't really swim anywhere because, it's like a shed. But that was kind of the way they thought it was acceptable for a Victorian woman to enjoy the water. And if you've ever seen pictures of bathing suits, like male bathing suits, they're ankle to neck. I mean, like they look like a pair of old-fashioned kids' pajamas. They completely cover the body because modesty was at its height in this time period. Okay. All right. So that is kind of some very much the highlights of the very wealthy members of the Victorian Society. And now what we're going to do is look at the other side. um, I think, although the amount of money and the awesomely cool houses and the clothing and the jewels and the paintings that you can look at, I mean, those are famous, but I honestly, to me, what comes to mind first when I think of the Victorian era is the jaw-dropping level of poverty that the society, which had so much money, allowed so many members of its group to sink to. Um, and I mentioned this earlier, that unbelievably arrogant idea from the upper and middle class that if you were poor, it was because you deserved it or you wanted to be. You were just lazy. Which, if anybody spends any amount of time looking at and studying how a competitive economy works, that is a complete and utter piece of illogic, I guess is the nicest way to say it. So, obviously there is no way to completely eradicate poverty in a competitive economy, but there are ways to alleviate it, and the Victorians kind of seem to me like they went out of their way to not alleviate it. So remember, the Victorian era is post-industrial revolution, and so you've got the economy creating a whole lot more stuff. And what happens is that means they're producing more food, they can build more houses, and they can produce more, stuff. And therefore, you get an increase in population. You also see an increase in medical advancements. And anytime medical advancements take a big jump, that means more people survive. And so you see a bigger population. Now, the other thing that was happening here, remember I said that the Industrial Revolution meant that the economy shifted from an agricultural economy to an industrial one. And what that means is, in an agricultural economy, the majority of people live out on farmable land. That's where they live because that's where they earn a living. But when factories come along, you get people who you've got too many people out on the countryside. There's not enough jobs or not enough food to support them, and so they go to the city to find work, and they get work in a factory. And so the Victorian era sees their cities kind of bloom in size, and although they were beginning to make some advancements in exactly how to keep that many people in that small an area healthy, they had a long way to go. And we see that in this era. This is that photograph I was saying earlier of the busy London street. And you see the men, and they're all wearing the black again. I can see one woman, maybe two. And, black and white photograph, you can't tell what color they're wearing, but the men all look the same. This is you see, you've still got horse-drawn carriages happening. Obviously, I know that eventually at the end of the Victorian era, you're going to see automobiles, but that's not happening here. This gives you an idea of the number of people. Also, the buildings, I would be very surprised if you could not find at least some of these buildings still in this place in London, because Europe does an incredibly good job at preserving buildings. Now, they don't preserve everything, obviously, that's impossible. And you would see kind of interspersed. You'd have the historic building, and then you'd have a modern one, and then a historic, and then a modern one. But there are areas in European cities where all of the older buildings have been preserved, kind of the old town area. And that looks like St. Peter's in the background, the biggest kind of dome back there. So this would be relatively close to kind of the core of London. Okay, next. This, I looked for a picture, like an actual photograph, and didn't find one. And so this is a model built to demonstrate the homes where the poor, the really poor, the ones who couldn't get out of the poor, that level, the ones who basically begged for a living or stole where they lived. And you can tell the dilapidation. Ironically, these houses would have been owned by the upper class, and it was a source of money for them, but also they didn't want anybody to know they owned these places because, if you're the landlord, you're the one who's expected to keep the building up. And as you can see, they did not. Holes in the roof, the fact that there's any window glass in this model at all, to me, is really surprising. I would imagine that glass would have been long ago either broken or stolen and sold. And these dilapidated buildings that probably were falling down, like literally falling down. People lived in them. You would see multiple families in a single room, no heating, no cooling, no sanitation. There was not going to be running water in these houses. And so you had a chamber pot that you went to the bathroom in, that everybody in the room went to the bathroom in, and then somebody would have to go dump it someplace. In the poorest levels of London, the sewage system would have been exceptionally primitive or poorly maintained. And so your chances of illness simply from coming into contact with raw sewage would be incredibly high. Okay, this is a quote from Kello Chesney, a book called The Victorian Underworld. Hideous slums, some of them acres wide, some no more than crannies of obscure misery, make up a substantial part of the metropolis. In big, once handsome houses, 30 or more people of all ages may inhabit a single room. And so there would be areas of London that, you'd have, I don't know, mile after mile, but a significant block after block of these slums where they were that crammed, they were things were that bad. And then other places you'd have this tiny little finger, like a single building that kind of stuck out into an area that had more money. But it was very much, the people who, if you didn't have to go to those places, you didn't. So what that meant is the middle class, the upper class could essentially ignore that these people existed because they never saw them. They didn't have to mingle with them. They didn't have to see them when they went someplace. And so their life was just like, oh yeah, whatever, they're over there, I don't care. And you definitely had people in the middle and upper class who understood the problem and tried to help. You did. I do not want to make you think that the Victorians were heartless people. They weren't. At least some of them weren't. Um, but the way it was set up, it was not difficult for them to avoid it. 30 people in one room. Imagine that. 30 people. What is that? Say, if you're lucky, 3 families. Um, this is that cycle. You were born in that room. Your mother was incredibly malnourished, and so you were born behind. You were not well when you were born. She was not able to nurse you very well because she didn't have the nutrition to give you what you needed. You would be given no schooling because no one would do it. There would be no schooling available for you. And so as soon as you could walk, they would put you to work doing whatever they could, whether that was some sort of crime, or if you were little, you could become a chimney sweep. Or maybe you might be an apprentice to somebody who had some sort of job in that area, but not a lot of options there. And then you grew up, if you survived, and you were essentially still in that room. There was no way to break out of that cycle. Okay, so um, pollution. And this is a painting of the factories in London during the Victorian era. Industrial Revolution brings great technical advancements, brings factories. How are those factories run? Where do they get their power? Coal. I don't know if you know anything about coal, but it is incredibly dirty. And when you burn it, it does give off heat, but it also gives off a tremendous amount of horrible, horrible black smoke. And these factories didn't have anything that would prevent that black smoke from going everywhere. And not only were the factories using coal, but that was how most of the homes were, if not all of the homes, were heated in London. And so you've got chimney after chimney belching out this horrible, noxious black fog. Today to us, with what we kind of consider to be clean air, we would be horrified. Everything got coated in this horrible black, and there was no way out. There was nowhere you could go. Poor, rich, royalty, slumlord, did not matter. Everywhere you went in London, you got in this. Imagine what that did to health. It's bad enough that you're incredibly poor and you have no nutrition, and then you're breathing in coal dust. This is a photo of the pollution. This would have been every day. If you were lucky, the wind was blowing it away from wherever you happened to be that day, but you couldn't count on that. London is famous for its fog. Because of where it is situated with the way the jet stream works, London gets a lot of fog. And it's also famous for its yellow fog. Because the pollution would combine with the water particles, and you would get this horrible, sickening yellow fog that I guess to us, again, I think we would just be completely aghast if we ever had to endure this level of pollution. But they saw this as the price of advancement. Okay, if we're going to have this technical advancement, if we're going to be the greatest nation on earth, well, we got to put up with the pollution. And to be fair, they didn't know any different. To us today, to go backward, we would be horrified because we're used to, even if we do have factories, they've got super complicated cleaning things that sit on top of those smokestacks and scrub all of the pollution out. The EPA keeps a really close monitor on how much pollution a factory is allowed to put out into the atmosphere. And, so we would be horrified. To them, this was just the way it was. I think they also didn't necessarily have a good grasp of how much this affected people's health, or at least they didn't in the beginning. Okay. Oh, this is a workhouse. Okay, so one of the solutions that the upper and middle class had for the poor in Victorian England was a workhouse. And this was some sort of building where the poor could go and live, and you would get some food, not good food, and not enough, but you'd get something. And they give you some sort of job. Like this looks like, they have their own garden plots. So somebody's doing some farming to feed the people that work on the workhouse. But conditions in workhouses were beyond horrible. Um, there were people that basically would rather die than go to a workhouse. These poor people. It's like I don't care how bad life is on the streets. I don't want to go to a workhouse, which of course then fuels that upper class idea that the poor are lazy. Right? What do you mean you don't want to go to a workhouse? You're just lazy. You don't want to work for a living. Well, no, it's not they don't want to go there. Not that they don't want to work. It's that the conditions are worse inside than they are outside. Um, but this was kind of the upper class's bad idea solution for the workhouse. And it justified their disdain and allowed them to continue to basically ignore the poor. Factories. Okay. You've probably seen something like this before. It looks like they're making paper, honestly. And the reason I show you this is that I want you to kind of imagine being one of the people who had to work here. There would be no um, safety regulations for the workers. This is a long time before people realized that workers deserved to not be put into danger when they go to work, and so there were no protections for workers. What that meant was your boss could fire you for anything. Let's say you were sick and you were throwing up and you couldn't physically go to work that day. You show up the next day, you're fired because you missed a day at work. There was no sick leave. Let's say that one of these machines gets stuck and you have to fix it and it takes you longer than your supervisor thinks it should, you can be fired. No protections whatsoever. What happens if you stick your hand into this thing and it rips your arm off? Doesn't matter. You bleed out, you die, you're fired. You can't work anymore. There were no protections. There was nothing that said you could only work an 8-hour day. They could work you as long as they wanted you to, as many days as they wanted you to. Because if you said, I quit, I'm not going to work under these conditions, there were like, a dozen people right behind you going, oh, I will, I will, I will. And so you see these factory owners making money hand over fist. And basically, one of the ways they're doing that is they're able to treat their workers as disposable. The next picture is a pretty famous picture of a little girl working in what looks like some sort of fabric factory. When you Google, Victorian factory child labor, this is one of the very first pictures you get. And children were not exempt. There was nothing saying that you had to be a certain age before you could go to work. And there was definitely nothing that said, say a 16-year-old can only work so many hours a day. If you were physically big enough to do the work and you could get yourself a job, you got it. And so here's this little girl who's working in this factory. And imagine all of those bobbins on either side of her are moving as fast as they physically can. And her job probably is to take the bobbin off and start a new one whenever it gets full. And yet they wouldn't stop. And so she'd have to dart in there, grab it at just the right second, hope it didn't burn her hand off, and get a new one started. I also wanted you to notice what she's wearing. I showed you the clothing pictures of the women's dresses. That was the upper class. And the woman who could afford to buy, 3 or 4 of those evening gowns a year and wear them once, lived in a completely different world than this little girl. This very much could be her only dress. Look how filthy it is. There was no such thing as a clean pair of a clean uniform. The chances of her being able to to get this clean would be slim. Her hair is short, very likely, because that's the easiest way to take care of it. And so this is that other side. On the upper side, you've got that unbelievable wealth and all that disposable income. Let's panel an entire room. Let's buy a dozen dresses every 3 months. And then you've got this little girl who probably works 12, 16-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. And she has one dress that she can't afford to have clean. That's the dichotomy between them in the Victorian society, is that unbelievable wealth and the unbelievable poverty. Okay, so that's kind of giving you an idea of the society, the wealthy and the poor. And so the next section we're going to talk about is the technology um, introduction, kind of how many of the things that we look at as kind of standard parts of our lives were invented in this time period. So first, let's talk about transportation. In the year 1800, if your feet weren't moving you, you had two choices: a horse or a boat where the wind was going to move you. That was it. And then by the end of the Victorian era, they have automobiles and they're making great strides into aircraft. So a huge jump. This is a steam engine locomotive. You guys have already probably had the background on steam engines, so I'm not going to do that one again. But what this meant very quickly was that it did not take you days and days or a week and a half to travel from one end of the country to the next. You could do it in hours. Our world today takes transportation completely for granted. Many of you are probably accustomed to living out in the country and driving to school or having someone drive you to school every single day. And so the commute of 10, 15, 20 minutes, that doesn't faze you. I live half an hour away from the school, and so I drive to the school and away from the school half an hour both ways every day, and that is completely fine with me. I don't have a problem with it. But that's what transportation has allowed us to do. In this time period before the Victorian era and in the early areas of this, that you had to live in a small area and you never really traveled beyond that. Everybody you knew in your family, they all lived in that same area as well. And then the train comes along, and suddenly you can live in London and then go visit Manchester for the day and then come back. And so things kind of opened up, I guess, is the idea with transportation. This is a photograph of the London Tube, which is the subway system, which was invented and created during the Victorian era. It was a huge advancement because you weren't dealing with traffic anymore. You can see that this looks very kind of claustrophobic. I've read some accounts that it was really loud and really smoky because they were running on coal probably, and they didn't ventilate these tunnels. And so a lot of people were really terrified because it was so dark and smoky and loud and fast. And, they were just terrified by this thing. But, people got over it. But this, it's one thing to build tracks on top of, on the land, and run a train over it, but to imagine to have the technology to safely dig tunnels to run a subway system underneath a city that's already there, that takes a tremendous amount of know-how. And that's what we see in the Victorian era, is that they either knew how or were figuring out how to do things that we think of as very modern today. Okay, next section would be gas and electricity, and I mean like natural gas type things and electricity. Again, at the beginning of the Victorian era, if you wanted to do something after the sun went down, you used a candle or the moon. And then by the end of it, they had light bulbs. This is a photograph, a modern photograph, obviously with modern lights. This is Westminster. You've got Big Ben, there in the corner. But this lamp is obviously probably electric today. However, this would have been gas at some point. And so every night, someone would have come along and turned on the gas a little bit, and then held up, some sort of light to spark, and then light each one of those lamps, and then close the little glass, and then probably at dawn, come back around and turn the gas back off again. And so gas, really, for the first time, Europe was able to stay up and to have very reliable and pretty quickly very cheap lighting after the sun went down. Candles were very expensive whenever that was what you depended on completely for light, and so only the very upper classes would have had the money to have enough candles to light like a big room. And then gas comes along, and suddenly the middle class and even the lower classes, some of them can have light. Tremendous advancement. Gas would eventually be subsumed by electricity, but I don't really know how quickly that happened. I mean, obviously, we know the invention of the light bulb, but how quickly that got into everybody's houses, I'm not really certain. The next section I want to talk about is communication. Beginning of the Victorian era, if you wanted to communicate with someone who was not close to you, you wrote them a letter. And by the end, they had primitive telephones. 1834 is the invention of the telegraph machine, which I think we could probably think of it as kind of a primitive way of texting, because you were very restricted in the number of letters that you could put in your message, and so everything was really pared down. But this is the first time you could send messages over a long um, um, physical distance. The next thing, which I know you're not going to be excited about, but they would have been, in 1867 is the typewriter. And I notice how decorated this is. That's that Victorian idea of, if we can decorate it, we should. And I know typewriters are not even a part of our lives anymore today, but just imagine how how much this would have changed, say, the world of business. Beforehand, you would have businesses that would hire people to do nothing but copy letters all day long, to write things down all day long. That was their job. And they were hired because they had beautiful penmanship. And then suddenly now, if you teach somebody to use a typewriter, you've got one person who can probably do the work of 5 or 10 people who are writing by hand and do it much more quickly. So the typewriter was a huge advancement for communication. And of course, I mean, it's the basis of computers and, mobile phones and those things today. So definitely we've just advanced. And then lastly, of course, the telephone. 1898 is kind of the date here, and we look on these phones as being very primitive, but for the first time you could hear voices over a distance. It was no longer, just a few short lines in a telegraph. So tremendous advancements in communication in the Victorian era. Okay, photography. There were a bunch of people working to invent photography, and different people kind of had different versions. And 1826 is kind of a good beginning year to say, okay, here's the first photograph, although that's very debatable. Obviously, there are lots of very old photographs out there. I wanted to show you some. This one I chose because it shows you the Victorians weren't these terribly stiff, unrealistic, lacking humor type people. I mean, this is a photograph of a guy playing cards with his dog who's wearing glasses and smoking a pipe. And so the Victorians were human. I talk about them I talk about people in these slideshows, and sometimes it's like they were somehow different than us, just in terms of being people. And this photograph, I think, illustrates that that's not the case at all. I don't have one in here in the slideshow, but the beginning of cat memes. The Victorians were the first cat memers. They dressed their cats up, they took photographs, and then they hand wrote little captions in. And so, they were people. This next one is kind of an oddity. You've probably seen old photographs where everybody in the photo looks incredibly stiff and serious. They've got a frown on their face. And the reason for this was, in the beginning, it took a really long time for the photograph to be taken. Like, how we take it with the camera today, we click and it happens in less than a second. Well, it could take minutes for that action to happen. And so you had to stay completely still. Otherwise, it was a blurry photograph. And that's why everybody in those photographs, or many of them, are very stiff and serious looking, because it was easier to hold that pose than a smile. This is a way they got around this. You want to have a kid, a picture of your kid, okay? Well, how are you going to get what looks like a 1-year-old to sit still, completely still for 5 minutes? Well, that's what they did in this photograph. Looks like he's sitting in a chair, doesn't it? He's not. He's on his mother's lap, but they've covered her and then put some sort of metal or wooden thing over so it looks like a chair. She is sitting there. You can see her arm out to the right, and once you know what you're looking at, oh yeah, that's a woman back there just covered in some sort of blanket. But this was a way they got around having to have the child stay still for a long period of time, because he'd probably stay still longer on his mother's lap than in a chair. And yes, this is probably a little boy, and he's wearing a dress because for a very long time, children wore dresses, whether you were a boy or a girl, simply because that was the easiest way for them to access a diaper. And then once you were potty trained, they could put little boys in pants and little girls stayed in dresses. Okay, the next section is medical advancements, lots of them. The first one, which again we completely take for granted in 1817, was the stethoscope. Again, to us today, I mean, if you were a child, you may have had a play stethoscope. We take this for granted, the idea that you can hear somebody's heartbeat, but this would have been a tremendous revolution, because although I'm sure they could have, set their ear against your chest and listened, this gave such a more clear picture that they could hear irregular heartbeats, they could hear heart murmurs, and so it gave them a lot more information. This is an X-ray. This is the first medical X-ray, as the caption says. 1895. Of his wife's hand, and I don't know if that's a ring or some horrible, horrible deformity, but X-rays. So 1817, they've invented a way to hear your heartbeat, and then 80 years later, they're taking pictures inside your body without cutting you open. That's the level of advancement we're talking about here. Science in general. Obviously, there were lots of scientific advancements. I want to talk about one that you may not know about. This is an illustration of the man with the map in his hand, and he's looking in the water. This guy's name was Dr. John Snow. And he proved how cholera was transmitted, and also kind of reaffirmed how disease is transmitted. Before the 1800s, or before this era, scientists, doctors, their best guess at how disease was transmitted, and the theory that most people accepted, was that it was transmitted via air, that it was like bad air. So they would keep their windows closed at night because they thought diseases could somehow magically travel in. And they obviously didn't really have any idea. And cholera is, I guess, this terrible, terrible disease that is caused by exposure to raw sewage. And what happens when you get cholera is that you begin to have uncontrollable diarrhea. In fact, it's so bad, you dehydrate and die from it. The first successful treatments for cholera were simply figuring out how to get enough water into your body for your body's immune system to beat the virus or the bacteria or whatever cholera is. Like literally, that was it. Once they figured out how to keep enough water in your body can fight off the infection or virus or whatever it was. So cholera killed people. It was a terrible, terrible disease. They didn't know how it was spread. Well, the policeman who's got his hand on that stick thing, that's a water pump. Before every house had running water, if you lived in a city and you needed water, you went to your local water pump. In the center of your neighborhood, there would be a pump, and you'd take some sort of vessel with you and you'd fill it up and you'd get water and you go back to your house. The problem is, they had not done a very good job. Well, they tried, but they had not succeeded at keeping sewage out of the drinking water system. And Snow focused on a cholera epidemic that it was an outbreak in a place in London, and he basically traced the outbreak to this one pump. And he was able to show that everybody who got sick had drank water from that pump, and that's where the disease had come from. This is Broad Street Pump. That's the name of the pump. This is a memorial marking it. And the other thing that's interesting about Snow is that people didn't believe him. He did an incredible amount of legwork and investigation, and he discovered like the ways that you'd have the like essentially what they would have had as a septic tank where they dumped their waste would have been made out of brick. And if you know anything about brick, it's not necessarily watertight, and so the sewage would then seep out of that septic tank thing down into the water system and get into the water that people were taking out of the Broad Street pump. And Snow proved it. It took people for a while to actually agree with him and believe it, but this is a tremendous jump forward because it means that suddenly you can tell these cities you have to keep these two water systems separate. And we take clean, safe water in America for granted. Um, and the idea that we couldn't get water from our kitchen sink is something we rarely even think about. But the reason we can is because of people like Dr. John Snow, who worked to prove that, yes, we do need to keep the sewage system and the drinking system separate. And this is one of the advancements that we saw in the Victorian era. Okay, I'm going to take a pause there. Okay, so that takes us basically kind of the end of the giant exploration of 5 minutes worth of Victorian history. And now we're going to talk about Oscar Wilde, and then I'll talk about the play a little bit, and then I end up talking about comedy at the end of this presentation. So, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was Irish. He spent most of his time once he was an adult in England, but he was very much from Ireland. He was born in Dublin in 1854, and he died in Paris in 1900. There are several very, very famous pictures of Oscar Wilde, and this is probably one of the most famous ones. I guess probably one word you could use to describe him was very dramatic, as you can tell from this picture. He was an author and he was a speaker. He made a very good living traveling around speaking. He was very entertaining, but very dramatic. And you can tell in this painting, this picture, that he is definitely not trying to blend into the background, I guess you might say. He was Irish, but he was upper class Irish. His parents were very educated. His father was a dentist. His mother was a writer herself. And so he was from a privileged background. And he was brilliant. He in school he did perfectly. He won every prize there was. So this is a very, very intelligent man. And he wrote plays, he wrote poetry, he wrote essays, at least one novel that I know of, and he was a speaker. In fact, he spent quite a bit of time touring America and speaking, and it was very entertaining, funny, sarcastic, somebody that he was magnetic, I guess. He did marry, he had 2 sons, and I'll talk more about that when we get to the trial. 3 things that he is famous for: leading the aestheticism movement, which again I'll talk about in a second, his wit. Wit means that your ability to make funny comments. Generally, we might call this sarcastic today. Somebody who's always got a funny comeback or a sarcastic comment, that's wit. And the third thing he is very famous for was being convicted for homosexuality. Okay, so the least interesting of the 3, the aestheticism movement. And this can be boiled down to the idea that art was not supposed to have any sort of big, meaningful purpose, not supposed to be useful or practical. It was just supposed to be enjoyed as art. Um, Art for art's sake is an Oscar Wilde quote. And he loved the idea that you artists created art just because they did. It didn't have to be useful. It didn't have to do something or serve some sort of function. It just existed, which I think really is a good illustration of him, because that seems so frivolous and kind of just, I don't know, wasteful to think that the main thing you produce in your life is just because you want to produce it. Many of us would think that's kind of silly, but I think that's a good way to see him. I've got a couple of examples. This is a door from the aesthetic movement, and it's very pretty. It looks kind of Art Deco to me, honestly, but it is a good example of the art from this time period. And my next picture is even better. This is a modern house, but it is an example of the aesthetic movement. And I think it's the best example I've ever run across, because it's a whole house, but notice it's made completely of glass. And so is this useful for anything except for people to look at and go, wow, that's really cool? You know, that's a perfect example of it's utterly useless, but it's art. So, admire it. That's kind of the idea with aestheticism. Um, his wit. He is famous for his funny, short, kind of epigrammic comments. And I've just chosen a couple. This one: man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth. Now, the thing about an epigram, and many things that Oscar Wilde says, is that they're funny and yet they're also kind of profound. Like you go, oh, wait a minute, that really is kind of a deep, important, meaningful thing to say. It's funny, but it's also really meaningful. And this is a lovely example where he says that if somebody is allowed to hide who they are, they're going to be more truthful with you. Um, which I think is maybe ironic considering his situation. I think you could also apply this to kind of the way we see things, and the internet today, and the way that some people will say things on the internet that they never would in person, because it gives them a mask. Same picture, another quote: an idea that is not dangerous is unworthy of being called an idea at all. Here's another aspect I think you have to understand about Wilde, is that he was a risk taker, a thrill seeker. And so he would make these kind of scandalous, shocking comments just because he wanted to shock people. That's a huge part of his personality, as far as I can see, is that he was flamboyant and dramatic, and he wanted to be the center of attention. And if he had to be kind of shocking to get that way, he was okay with that. Um, so let's talk about the trial. And before we get there, let me talk about being gay, I guess, in this time period. Um, what we today consider the spectrum of sexual preference: gay, bisexual, heterosexual, asexual, whatever. Um, None of those things existed. They definitely were aware that some men like to have sex with some men. But they didn't consider it to be something you did as a part of your, like, it wasn't a way you lived. It was just this aberration, this behavior that people thought was horrible. And so the idea that we would have considered him to be a homosexual by our standards, and yet he married and had 2 children, that's what you did. The idea of living openly as what we would consider to be a gay man was not something that ever happened back then. And so he married, he had children, and the evidence suggests he did love his wife. I mean, there's nothing saying he couldn't, just because he, preferred sex with men. But he was then later seduced by a friend, and then later he meets and falls in love with a younger man named Bosie Douglas, which is what kind of leads him to the trial and ruin. Okay. Homosexuality was illegal in Britain at the time. In fact, it was illegal until I want to say 1962 was when it was decriminalized, I guess is the good way to say that. It's not like they went, oh, yeah, go ahead. Um, and so he's married, he's an adult, probably late 30s, early 40s would be my guess. And he meets this young man and falls in love with him. This is Alfred Douglas, Lord Alfred Douglas. His middle nickname was Bosie. And so Oscar Wilde was the upper middle class, but he was not titled. Bosie was the aristocracy. He was a titled person. His father was the Marquess of Queensberry. So he falls in love with Bosie. We have a photograph taken of the two of them, Oscar posing, because I think he never took a photograph that he didn't pose in. We can make assumptions about this photograph that he's posing and that Bosie looks really unhappy, or it could just be that, they were tired and they had to sit there and pose for a long time and he didn't want to sit there any longer. But the fact they had this photograph made did not indicate some sort of inappropriate relationship, because we look at this time period and the way men behaved with each other through the lens of the way we think about homosexuality. And we live in a world where boys and men are not allowed to have any sort of physical contact or any sort of intimacy with each other without somebody else going, "Ooh, are you gay?" That was not the case in this time period. And so men were allowed to be very physically affectionate with each other. They could hug, they could kiss, they could dance, and nobody thought otherwise. Okay. So you have to, we look at this photograph and go, aha, proof. It wasn't. It was just two friends taking a photograph. That would not have been unusual. Here we have another photo of Bosie. Apparently he gave to Oscar from 1894. And so the thing is that they didn't really go out of their way to hide this relationship. Remember how I said that Oscar Wilde liked shocking people? I think he looked at this as a way to do that. I think he probably really did have feelings for this man, but at the same time, he didn't mind taking the risk. Now, Bosie Douglas, on the other hand, had, I think, some ulterior motives. He was had a very unhappy relationship with his father. And I really think, looking at the evidence, that Bosie's relationship with Oscar was very much striking back at his father. And unfortunately, he really kind of entangles Oscar Wilde in this family fight. And it kills him. I mean, it kills Oscar Wilde, essentially. So here's Bosie's father, the Marquess of Queensberry. I don't know why this is a photograph of him with a bicycle, but whatever. And the thing besides being Bosie Douglas's father, that this guy is famous for, is he's the one who finalized and kind of gave his name to the official rules of boxing. If you know anything about boxing, there's something called Queensberry rules. They come from this man. And I think that's a good illustration of his character. He was forceful. He was overbearing. He probably made his son's life pretty miserable, telling him what to do. And Bosie just decided to strike back at him. And the unfortunate thing here is that Queensberry decides to go after Oscar Wilde rather than trying to deal with his own son and his problems. And that leads to Oscar's destruction. So Bosie is probably, saying to his father, haha, look what I'm doing. I don't care. His father threatens to cut him off from his inheritance and stop letting him have money. Bosie doubles down and, probably goes out and does more things with Oscar and is seen with him. And so Queensberry tries to go after Wilde, and one of the ways he does this is he threatens to go to like the opening night of one of Oscar's plays and like throw things and shout and basically ruin the debut of a play. And Wilde took it as a joke and kind of publicized this threat, let his friends know, and so his friends, not only did they wore this green carnation like in solidarity, like we're all going to come to this play, we're going to wear this carnation to show that we support Oscar. They also prevented Queensberry from actually getting into the theater, and so they prevented this. Now, unfortunately, this is not going to solve the problem. It's just going to make this guy angrier. But Oscar Wilde really, I don't think, took it seriously. He did not think this was something that he needed to worry about. So the next step, Queensberry. Okay, so his father threatens to disinherit him. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going out of order here. This is the next level. This is a calling card. This is the Marquess of Queensberry's calling card. And a calling card was literally a card with your name on it that when you went to visit somebody's house, you performed a call and they weren't there, you'd leave your card. You could use it to write a note on. It's just, it's a card. And so Queensberry leaves this card at Oscar Wilde's club with this quote on it. And people think what he meant to say was to Oscar Wilde posing as a sodomite. The handwriting's pretty bad. But a person's club in Victorian England, this was a place where a man could go and basically be with his other men friends. There were no women allowed. You could eat, you could smoke, you could gamble, you could read. There's probably places to take naps if you wanted to. It was a way for a wealthy man to get out of the house and find some place to go hang out with their friends. Anyway, it was a public place. And so when Queensberry leaves this card for Wilde with this line on it, this is like publicly accusing Oscar Wilde of being homosexual. And so this is a step up. This is no longer just rumor and innuendo. This is public. And so what happens is where am I? Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. So what happens is that, let's see next. Yeah. I don't know. It wasn't really clear to me whose idea it was to sue Queensberry for libel, but Bosie definitely encouraged Oscar to do it. Libel is when you accuse someone of saying something about you that's not true, and you can sue. You can take them to court and say, you said that I have 3 legs. I don't have 3 legs. It's all about reputation. Now, Oscar's other friends were really they didn't think this was a good idea, because libel means that you are saying that whatever that person said isn't true, but it was kind of an open secret that Oscar Wilde was having a homosexual relationship with Bosie Douglas. And so it just seemed to them, and it seems to us when we look at this, suing somebody for what you say is them lying about you, but what they actually said is true, does not sound like a good idea. But Wilde did it anyway because he was all about that risk taking. And again, I think he saw it as a joke. So he takes Queensberry to court. And this is an illustration of the trial. I think this actually may be from the second trial. But the first trial, the Old Bailey, is like the courthouse. It's the name of the courthouse. So Oscar Wilde takes the Marquess of Queensberry to court and says, you said this publicly about me, you lied. And the thing is that Wilde totally did not take this seriously. They put him on they questioned him, and he made jokes, and he was trying to be really entertaining. But the problem is that all of the evidence that comes out in this trial basically is enough evidence for people to start thinking, oh, maybe Oscar Wilde really is a homosexual. And so the end of this trial, I don't know if Wilde just decided to say whatever, I'm dropping the charges, or if the judges said there wasn't enough proof or whatever. But this trial, the first one, kind of ends without any sort of resolution. Immediately afterwards, though, the police arrest Oscar Wilde on charges of homosexual acts, which is illegal. And so what happens is Oscar's ego and his inability to take this seriously in the first trial kind of creates all of the evidence needed to convict him in the second trial. And that's what happens. There are letters there are witnesses, and there's enough proof for him to be convicted. I don't know what the technical term was, but of probably performing homosexual acts. I don't know. Anyway, and he's ruined. He is utterly ruined. I mean, he loses all respect from society. He would have been openly shunned. He is sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Hard labor means just what it sounds like. From sun up to sundown, you are doing physically hard, punishing labor. I know one of the things they would have them do is break up big rocks into little rocks. They might put them on a treadmill and make them walk on a treadmill for hours and hours and hours to power something, to do something. The point was not to actually produce anything meaningful, it was to just punish them. 12 hours a day of hard, back-breaking labor. And so this, combined with the utter humiliation and the shame and probably the horrible malnutrition in being in a Victorian jail, breaks his health. And whenever he gets out of jail, he is a broken man. Now, his wife never publicly denounces him. She can't really. But she can't take him back. He cannot go back and live with her in society, because then society will shun her and his children. There is some evidence that she financially supported him, that she continued to give him money, but he couldn't go back to the marriage. And Bosie probably went off to cause problems for somebody else. He didn't get any trouble. So Oscar Wilde goes to Paris. He's broke. He's depressed, he's ill, and I think he lives for like 2 years, maybe. This is supposedly his last words. That people find it kind of appropriate that his last words would be a quip again, that wit, that wallpaper goes or I do, and then he dies. He's buried in Paris. His grave is one of the more famous graves that people visit as kind of a tourist attraction in Paris, along with Jimi Hendrix's, I think. So that's Oscar Wilde, and his life is important, I think, but we obviously want to look at the play. So the play we're going to read is called The Importance of Being Earnest, obviously. And hang on. All right, I want to back up here. Obviously, he is famous for his writing because he's very, very talented as well. But we're going to look at his comedies here. And the thing you need to remember about this play is that even though it is funny and very silly, very, very silly, it's also some social commentary. And that's why we read this play, because if it were just the funny part, that's not something that I would, think important enough to spend time on in class. But it is social commentary on the upper class of England and Ireland. And this is a good example of his aestheticism movement, because on the surface, this play does look like it's just art for art's sake, that it's just light and meaningless and entertaining, that you can go watch it and that it's never going to affect your life. But just like his epigrams, his sayings, if you actually kind of take it apart, you realize there's a lot more meaning. The first thing I would point out is the title itself, because the title is a pun. Which I'll let you kind of discover as you read the play. So this is a quote from Wilde about the play. It's exquisitely trivial, a delicate bubble of fancy, and it has its philosophy that we should treat all the trivial things of life seriously and all the serious things of life with sincere and studied triviality. In other words, this is ridiculous and shouldn't be taken seriously, is what he's saying. And so he's working really hard to let this play, or make this play, seem to not be very meaningful. And yet I think, and it's very entertaining. I mean, I will give you that. It's very entertaining to read. It's entertaining to watch if you ever get to see a stage production of it. But the kind of the more interesting social commentary, I think, is for me the important part of this. Here are some ideas you want to look for, things that he's making fun of with the upper class. He is making fun of their ideas about marriage. And we have this idea that the upper class in England only married for money. Like it was always like a business arrangement. And I don't think it was ever only. There were definitely marriages in the upper class made simply because one family has money, another family has money. When we get them together, they're going to have more money altogether, you know. But I think that more marriages than we would um, think were based on affection. But he's going to make fun of the idea of why you should marry, or at least the stereotypical idea. He's going to make fun of society's rules about how you're supposed to act. Classes, definitely. There are just a couple of servants in this play, but if you look carefully at their interaction and what they say to the main characters, you get an idea of some pretty humorous ideas about the worth of these different social classes. He definitely makes fun of love. He doesn't make fun of deceit. There's just a whole lot of it in this play. Everybody lies, and nobody gets in trouble for it. Reputation, definitely. Although the kind of reputation um, that they're what's the word for that they think is important in the play is probably the least kind of important, least kind of important kind of reputation, which I think is the point. That's his point, is that he's going to have them talk about reputation as though, okay, so this is the most important thing for your reputation. And yet what we take away from it is, oh, okay, actually that's the least important thing. And that's what you need to remember about this play, is that what the characters are saying is not necessarily what you're supposed to take away, because it's supposed to be ironic, right? You say one thing, but you mean something else. It's his characters say one thing, but the playwright means something else, if that makes sense to you. A couple of photographs of stage productions that may very well have been from productions during Wilde's lifetime. This is from the cigarette case scene, whenever Algernon and Jack are arguing over the cigarette case. And a cigarette case is simply probably a silver little case that's thin that you can fit in your coat pocket, and you kept your cigarettes in them. And then here we have Cecily and Gwendolyn's reconciliation later in the play, whenever they decide that it's more important that they stand together, united against the men, than that they fight amongst themselves. And this also shows you that later Victorian women's dress style. You can see that the skirts, the hoop skirts are gone, and they've got those huge sleeves. They're called mutton chop sleeves. Anyway. Okay, so I don't want to give you a whole lot of information about the play. I want you to read it, but remember that irony, okay? Nothing else. Irony is you say one thing, you mean something else, right? That's the way you want to think about the play. It is supposed to be silly. These characters are supposed to be ridiculous. That's kind of the idea, is that we laugh at them because they are so ridiculous, which takes me to comedy. You have a handout in your handout section, or actually it may be in the nuts and bolts section, that stapled handout of yours, but it's about comedy. And I want to talk about comedy and kind of give you an idea, because this is the first time we're going to read one. Now, why do we need to talk about comedy? Well, because there's more to it than just entertainment. The handout talks about, there's a quote on the handout that says something like, comedy comes from the head rather than the heart. And what that person means is that you can laugh about things that, if somebody said something to you and said, oh, I think this is what's wrong with you, and they were serious, you get insulted. But if they make a joke about it, you're not as offended. And so you can laugh about something that if it were said to you straight, you would take offense at. And so laughter allows an author to explore things that otherwise the audience would never accept listening to. We know that comedy gives us basically the idea is a surprise. If we try to define why we laugh, we'd say, well, because something unexpected happens, and it surprises us, and then we laugh. Now, this is an illustration. This is the Comedy and Tragedy Max, and the reason why we care about this, why as an English teacher, why as an English student should we care about comedy and studying it, is that comedy gives us kind of the same thing that tragedy does. We know that tragedy fills a role in our lives because we are allowed to experience things through watching or reading that we don't have to go through on our own. Like, we don't have to experience that ourselves, that horrible tragedy ourselves, to get kind of the emotional release from it. And comedy is pretty much the same way. It allows us an emotional release that really helps us be, people. So the way we talk about this is we're going to talk about 4 different kinds. It's called the comedic ladder. There are 4 parts. Comedy of ideas up here, and then manners over here, comedy of manners, farce, and low comedy. So comedies of ideas. This is the comedic ladder, has kind of from serious to not serious. Serious at the top, not serious at the bottom, I guess. So comedies of ideas are going to be about big ideas, like kind of, theme level, love, hate, revenge, things like that. That's what comedy of ideas are going to be about. Some war, society, whatever, presidential campaign type issues. That's what comedy of ideas cover. Now, some examples. I don't know if you know what MASH is. It was a television show from the 70s and maybe the early 80s, and it was a comedy. It was set during the Korean War. It was set in like a field hospital in Korea during the Korean War, and so you have very funny, but at the same time, the fact that this is taking place during a war and that the characters, their entire job is to try to save the soldiers who've been injured in this war, allows the program to explore much deeper ideas. The theme song, or the theme, it's not, there are words. The name of the theme song is Suicide is Painless. Which, if nothing else, gives you an idea of the level of ideas that this program is trying to deal with. Very much a comedy of ideas. George Bernard Shaw's plays, probably the most famous one, is called Pygmalion. And the reason you might know this is that it was made into a musical called My Fair Lady in the 1960s, where you have an upper class Victorian gentleman who decides he's going to take one of those lower class women and make her a lady. And the struggles of turning this uneducated woman with a horrible accent into a lady that can pass in upper class Victorian society is the point of this story. But, ultimately he succeeds, and he creates this very refined, beautiful, elegant, well-mannered lady. But the end of it, of course, is that what really matters is, does it matter that she has a good accent now, or does it matter that she knows which fork to use? No, that's not the important thing. The most recent example I can think of would be The Simpsons. Possibly some of the episodes of South Park as well. But the episode of The Simpsons that I always think about for this is very early in The Simpsons run. There was an episode where Bart sold his soul. And it's an exploration of what the soul is and why it's important to us. 30-minute cartoon is talking about the importance of the human soul. I can't think of a better example of comedy of ideas than that. Okay, the next level is the comedy of manners. Now, this is where it's basically making fun of a society's rules of their manners. And many times, whenever you look up comedy of manners, the importance of being earnest is the example of it. And it's generally, they're going to be upper class people. They're going to be romantic issues. It's going to be funny and silly, which you'll see, Earnest, that's pretty much the definition of it. But it's making fun of the societies, the rules they say you have to follow. And I've got some quotes here. I think this actually comes from the comedy handout you have in your binder. But basically, the idea is that comedy of manner is all about the funny one-liners, the wit, where it says that it reduces life to witty repartee. And so you don't really have long, drawn out plot. You don't have a lot of character development. You have funny quotes. It sacrifices humanity to dialogue. And so the characters and the importance of being earnest are going to seem to be like ridiculous, flat, undeveloped, but they say some really funny things, and that's a mark of a comedy of manners. Puns, paradoxes, epigrams, all of these things are used in the service of satire, and I definitely classify Earnest as satire. Some examples, Frasier and Will and Grace were kind of the most recent examples I could think of. And both of these, you've got a group of people who kind of embody their society's manners, and then you see the show making fun of them. And I found an interesting definition of this where it said that in a comedy of manners, you have a character who really does know what's going on. You've got a character who thinks she knows what's going on, and then you've got another one who has no clue at all. And really, if you know anything about these two television shows, you can classify the characters that way. I just thought that was a really kind of entertaining way of thinking about comedy of manners. The next one is farce. I personally think Earnest falls under the category of farce as well. Um, um, well, let me show you the list, and you'll see if you'll agree. A farce typically has mistaken identities, coincidences that don't make any logical sense but make a lot of entertainment, mistimings. Like an example of a mistiming would be, character A walks into a room. If he had walked into the room 30 seconds later, the whole plot wouldn't happen. That's a mistiming. Farces don't make a lot of logical sense. Twins separated at birth is a common trope in a farce. Unhappy matches by tyrannical parents, money in birth causing problems. Farces are ridiculous and they're very funny. They're not supposed to have any big, meaningful ideas. And I think this play fits very well into this category. Some examples of farces, I think definitely, probably the one on here that to me stands out the most is the Austin Powers movies. Think about kind of how over the top those are and how ridiculous they are. And if you actually stopped to like look logically at them, they would fall apart. That's a farce. The last one is low comedy. This is the bottom of the ladder. And low comedy, generally, teenagers, especially boys, are going to be very, very familiar with low comedy. Low comedy is dirty jokes, bathroom humor, slapstick. The Three Stooges, if you know what that is. Um, Accidents happen in low humor comedy, and people laugh rather than going, "Oh my gosh, are you hurt?" Right? You laugh at those accidents. I mean, if you've ever watched or seen any clips of the Three Stooges, things happen to those characters that in real life would cause terrible injuries, but because it is a comedy, nothing bad happens to them. Uh, Examples: Beavis and Butthead and Dumb and Dumber. Both of these are probably a little bit old for you, but they're just, you know, I think of low humor as the kind of stuff that middle school boys, especially, just find hysterical, absolutely hysterical. Um, so these are kind of the four ideas of comedy. You're not going to need to worry about low humor with Earnest because there isn't any. Um, I would argue that comedy of manners, farce, that area is where you're going to see this play. Okay, the last thing on here is satire, because I think Earnest is a satire. Remember that satire is when you go to an extreme to make a point. And the thing you need to understand about this play is that the extreme Oscar Wilde goes to is in making his characters completely, utterly ridiculous. Okay. Utterly ridiculous. So don't read this play expecting these characters to be realistic, to say realistic things, to have realistic relationships. It's all about going to an extreme to prove how ridiculous something is. And so, obviously, I hope that you laugh and you enjoy the humor in this play, but I also want you to, as you read it, to be thinking about, okay, what is he commenting on? Like, what in upper class society in England, in Victorian England, is Oscar Wilde trying to point out a problem about? That's kind of the English teacher part of this play. Yeah, don't worry. Okay. Okay, this is the end of this, I'm sorry, very long introduction. I hope this helps you understand the play. If you have any questions, email me.